There are few races that have survived well in the Age of Chaos. The bulk of those that do, they survive because they're either a warlike people like the Oryx, and others survive because of their stubbornness, defenses, or elusiveness, think Daughters of Cain or Fire Slayers for example. But one race stands alone for using their intelligence, science, and cunning to not only survive the Age of Chaos, but to thrive during it. This week we are diving into the Kharadron Overlords. This is one of the most enigmatic races in Age of Sigmar. The Kharadron Overlords are a race that is shrouded in mystery, and we will explore who they are, how they survived the Age of Chaos, how they currently function, what their leadership and soldiers are like, and those amazing aircraft that give them the gift of flight. But in this video we're going to explore their origins. How does a race so iconic to mining and subterranean kingdoms find its home in the clouds? Well, we find a great deal of information about them in the core book. Specifically, if you look at the lore for the Realm of Metal, Chamon. Now, recently I did a video on the Realm of Metal itself, and I kind of put a footnote in there about the Kharadron Overlords, but if you want to learn more about the realm itself, which really is their origin point, I do suggest checking out that video. To briefly summarize the lore there, it's a realm that's made in the image of Grugni, one of the two Dwarden gods. It's a place of rich resources, metal, jewels, and all those things lead to great commerce and trade. The continent, or the region that the core book focuses on, is called the Spiral Crux, and it's basically a series of islands carved by Grugni. These islands are very heavily inhabited by Dwarden and humans, and it is a place of technological and mercantile achievement. With physical resources and a lot of ingenuity, they were able to create technological wonders like flying machines, got gyrocopters and such. And they soon discovered, this moment they lifted off from the ground, an exciting new resource. It's called ether gold. Ether gold is also called the breath of Grugni. And this is sort of a metal that has magical and alchemical properties, but it's in a gaseous state, rather than being a solid. Now, we've seen metals in other states before, most famously is mercury, which is more of a liquid, but ether gold hides amongst the clouds in a gas-like form. Now, the terminology they use to describe the mining process of ether gold is very reminiscent of things that you would see in the ground. So they would call a big patch of ether gold within a cloud, oh, that's a vein, much like we would say there's a vein of ore in the earth. Of course, to mine, quote-unquote, ether gold is very hard and dangerous because you have to get into a ship, get up into the air, survive all the different atmospheric dangers up there, collect, sift, and contain the ether gold and bring it back down. But when you do, the payoff is nearly immeasurable because it's not just metal, it has powerful magical properties. The first and foremost is that it acts as a power source. And the secondary effect, which is also extremely relevant and important, is that it can kind of create a field where gravity gets toyed with. I would say it's magical levitation, but the Kharadron Overlords don't really rely or think about magic. They don't perceive ether gold as being magical, they just think it's science that they're still researching. Now, advancements on studying ether gold took them very far. They were able to create incredible new machines with this new access to a reliable power source, innovative new technologies like engines and mining tools, and most importantly, it drove the field of aviation. They were able to use ether gold to build large ships that could fly. These ships could be built with cargo holds to bring back more ether gold, and kind of the entire process would start again. Trade was great, and the resource was both plentiful and highly in demand. And with so many ships flying in and out, ports became very congested. Now, it's like a real-world airport that cannot support the amount of ground traffic that it gets. So a solution was made. We're going to build a skyport, a levitating docking station so that ships can resupply, refuel, and clear out their cargo. And this really was the budding age of technology for the Dwarden and the humans in Chamon. Because all these things, as we're talking about them in the book, as far as the timeline goes, very, very new technology, very experimental. And what's terrible is that something horrible is happening in another part of the realm. Because while all these things were being invented and experimented with and kind of toyed around, Tzeentch chaos god, was trying to claw his way into Chamon. Now, I went over the kind of in-depth story about how he got into the realm on the realm video itself, but I'm just going to briefly summarize here. A giant rift tears open in the sky, and Tzeentch demons begin pouring through in mass. And their numbers are such that nothing can stand against them. The Dwarden, who go to their big fortresses and seal the doors, well, those fortresses become a prison, and now they're trapped, and eventually Tzeentch is able to claw through the doors and the walls and the windows, and they all just die. The flying demons terrorize the sky, shooting gouts of flame, and whole armies of horrors scour every foot of the ground. Any opposition that was organized fell apart at the feet of the Tzeentch demons. No fortress could stand against them, no hold was secure, no tribe was out of reach. And they were fighting this continuously losing battle. The remaining Dwarden were pushed back and back and back to their furthest mountain keeps, and they saw nowhere else to go to. But in these taller keeps, there were docked a number of airships, and so the Dwarden poured into the available skyships that they could find, because there was simply nowhere else to run to. And out of this mountain, a surge of skyships flew out. Now, to the Dwarden's surprise, they were able to tear through the flying demons with ease. They thought it would be much more difficult, that they were on their last leg, but the flying ships and the guns that they had put on them were able to really shoot down the screamers and any other random flying demons. And immediately they realized this was their solution, because these airships had just become their lifeboats. But instead of taking them from, a sinking ship to solid ground like a normal lifeboat would, this is reversed, where I have to leave solid ground because it's so inhospitable right now. And with that, they were raised up to the sky. Now, it must be hard to express the level of pandemonium at play here, because these scattered remnants of survivors have lost literally everything. Their family, their friends, their home, their realm. But they are alive for now, and you have to make it work. And so these scattered ships all came together to try and make a solution. Because at this point, they're functionally refugees with nowhere to land, and nothing around them is safe. All the ships link together, and they link to one of the nearby skyports, and they collectively become the first city in the clouds. Now, this reprieve, this break, was temporary at best. Once the immediate threat of survival was over, the next challenge was keeping this budding city afloat, because they needed to keep mining ether gold at now an unprecedented level. The entire civilization relies on keeping these ships afloat. And arguments quickly broke out as mining operations collided with one another. The local vein of ether gold was almost tapped out, and riots were brewing. Remember, this single resource keeps their personal ships in the sky, but it also keeps their society moving. And with resources so low and the stakes so high, these little disparate factions of Dwarden were near the brink of civil war. Now, at this point, the leader of each ship or clan, if they were organized by families, met together to try and find a solution. This was called the famous Council of Madrolta. And really the crux of the meeting was to say, okay, we've survived, but we need to come up with some kind of governing structure. Because if we don't, we're going to have survived only to kill ourselves later on. They saw the events of what went down in the realms as Grugni abandoning them. Their god didn't come to help them, so they needed to figure out things for themselves. How do we interact with each other in a healthy way? How can we not prey and steal from one another? And basically asking the question, how do we take our values, our justice, and our society and translate it to our current survival method? Because life looks different now, we need to become something different. We need to adapt. And this meeting was instrumental in forming the Code. This is the most important concept to understanding Kharadron Overlords, and we're going to come back to it numerous times throughout the week. Everything we're going to talk about is influenced by it, because it is a system of government, trade structure, business law, and worldview wrapped into one. It dictates how these skyports will survive without hurting one another, how individual trade companies will work for themselves, but also as part of the greater whole, how captain and crew interact, any obligations, trade structure, communication, everything, if you haven't figured it out. It's the rule of law that makes this lifestyle sustainable. And one important thing it also does, we're going to touch on a little bit when we talk about troops and stuff like that, is the idea that the old clans, the random family lineages that Dwarden were traditionally very attached to, like the deeds of their family and what their clan has accomplished. All that, the slate got wiped clean. There are no more clans. You're just a person who has to earn their keep. So everything went from being a lineage system to a merit-based system, which is a really hard right turn when you think about traditional dwarves or Dwarden. Now, after the Council of Madralta, the Kharadron Overlords, as we know them, were born. The various skyports broke apart from each other in search of fresh veins of ether gold, and so all across the skies of the mortal realms. The Dwarden sought riches, fame, and survival. They saw the carnage below them in the Age of Chaos, but they couldn't do anything to help, because they are also themselves are refugees and survivors, and you don't risk your only life raft. And so from this bleak start, time began to change them. Entire generations existed that were not born on land. They have no memory of living on the soil. Survival turned into stability, stability turned to growth, and growth turned into a thriving civilization. Cobbled together ports were expanded and grew into powerful new cities, and time took refugees and made them into a true civilization. And we're going to dive into what the Kharadron Overlords are like now, what they've morphed and grown into in tomorrow's video. But let's stop here when I talk about the origin stories, because this comes exclusively from the core book. Why does this story make them a cool faction? Well, first off, I love their origins. I think it's so unique that their technological marvels became their life raft overnight. It's a desperate need rather than a crowning achievement, that kind of change in how you view a technology. And I love how it inverts the idea of a lifeboat, like I talked about earlier. Usually a lifeboat takes you from one dangerous place to safe solid ground. Safe solid ground doesn't exist now, so it takes you to the dangerous place of the skies, but that's still somehow safer because of Tzeentch. And also, I just love the fact that they are so relatable right after their escape. In the real world, once immediate danger is over, we tend to squabble. That's why you'll see people in terrible survival situations, they kind of break apart because the transition from a terrible event to trying to survive and work together afterwards is a hard one for some to do. In addition to that, their solution is equally fascinating. So the code is just a cool idea. No other faction has such a unifying ideology and societal structure that they cling to. Now, we're going to talk about the different skyports and fleets and things like that, and they all kind of look at the code and relate to it a bit differently, but fundamentally they're all as a race on the same general page, which is not something you can say for every faction in the game. Their emphasis on science and technology over magic and sorcery gives us this kind of fascinating idea, right? Their minds, their intelligence conquered their extinction. And because of innovation and technology and sciences and devotion to those things, they were able to survive the worst cataclysm in the history of the realms. And I think that kind of lends itself to a few worldviews that might be very interesting, such as the idea of like, there's nothing we can't learn to overcome, right? There's no puzzle that we can't solve. There's no magic in quotes that we can't understand as science, and I kind of think that's a super unique concept. And so in tomorrow's video, we're going to explore how these kind of humble beginnings grow into a fully functional society and what that does to a Dwarden. In yesterday's video, we explored the tragic origins of the Kharadron Overlords. Torn from their homes, forced to live among the clouds in these experimental flying machines. To keep order, they banded together and formed the Code, a system of law and moral conduct that governs all aspects of their lives. But that was a long time ago, like hundreds of years, during the birth of the Age of Chaos. And today we're going to explore what that race of refugees was able to grow into. Who are the Kharadron Overlords as we know them today? We're going to explore the faction as a whole, its motivations, the sky fleets, and really seek to explore what kind of people do those origins and survival instincts create. Well, there's really two things that govern this faction or this race. That's science and technology as one, and commerce as the other. So let's break those down. The most obvious thing about the faction of Kharadron Overlords is their technology. The secret of Ether Gold has given them the gift of flight and a slew of fascinating weapons. Technological achievements have a very unique place in the minds of the Kharadron Overlords. During the Age of Chaos, it was their savior. The then largely experimental airships literally delivered them from harm, and continued advancements on that design allows their race to flourish and continue. When you factor in things like improvements in engine efficiency and things like that as technology evolves and advances, this means that the race can expand and flourish. And the importance of these ships and the need for them doesn't just stop at immediate danger, because it's also a vital piece of their continued existence. Smaller ships are designed at their core to gather ether gold, the most important resource the faction has. Research and development in ether gold technologies make life happen. You get bigger cities, more ships, higher populations. This dependency and respect for the sciences has more effects, because you also get efficient weapons and tough armor. But the most interesting one is the rejection of myths and legends. This is a faction where self-reliance has been deeply ingrained in them from their origins. Grugni didn't save them. They, and their technology, saved themselves. As such, they largely reject the old gods and myths, thinking it's just superstition, it's irrelevant, gods aren't going to come and save us. They believe the gods exist, but they have nothing to do with the Kharadron Overlords. There are a few minor stories and folklore, things like that across the race, but largely those are mostly for children. They place an emphasis on the practical. Their experience has shown them that the gods don't care. They play their own game. And it's a worldview that pits the act of inventing, of creating, above history, religion, and personal glory. And so all these things are the perfect recipe for a faction that is relentless in their intellectual endeavors. Bigger, better, more efficient, and cheaper, strong machines. Those are the concepts that took a desperate race and made them into a powerhouse, when the rest of the realms were falling apart. So that's the technological and science side of things, but that breeds the second part here, which is commerce. One of the most important aspects of the code was formalizing how trade and commerce were to function. The idea was to protect mining rights, how selling happens, and this is incredibly important for a few reasons. Science and technology don't happen without monumental resources. Physical materials, ether gold, manpower, education, workspaces. You can already see kind of the market building itself here. You need ships to gather supplies, companies that buy them, then sell to investors, who then invest in engineers to make more technology. Other ships collect ether gold, which is of course the most vital ingredient. You need a large workforce that is able to kind of carry out the day-to-day operations, and they all have to be paid and eat and live, and more ships to be built where these experiments can be run. The basic idea being need breeds opportunity, and this faction had a lot of needs in the beginning. So by quickly forming into companies all trying to meet each other's needs, a civilization formed, then an economy, with the code there to make sure that it never consumes itself or creates monopolies. Truthfully, it only took like an ounce of organization to make this whole thing work. Once you add on top of that luxury items were added into the economy once wealth became a thing. This concept of trade and merchant themes is really important. And it gets us back to what Dwarden were when they were dwarves back in the old world, this kind of tropes about them being greedy and out for self-gain and kind of grumpy misers, but they still retain their good and honorable qualities. This got kind of a reimagining of those ideas. But also, it is a mechanism for introducing them to the forces of order. Because isolation and seclusion had brought them this far, but it's the trade and commerce that's going to happen with other societies, other civilizations, that's going to take them to the next level. And so when they saw the gates of Azir open, opportunity presented itself, because these forces of order are going to need supplies, travel, materials, and the Kharadron Overlords stepped in and filled a vital role at that point. The rapid advancement of Order cities can really be tied to the Kharadron Overlord involvement. And as beneficial as they were to the kind of Grand Alliance of Order, it wasn't without tension. Because centuries of commerce, trade, and exchange under the code has made them into a very legalistic culture. They will honor any deal they make, they're good characters, but they will of course exploit every single loophole, every miswording, anything they can do to get the better end of the deal. They are super shifty when you're doing trades with them. And it can make them seem manipulative and underhanded, but it comes from a history of needing to be shrewd and very exact. To them, the letter of the law trumps the spirit of the law. So even though as they're adding value to the forces of order, there's still a very distinct tension to it. Now we'll discuss in tomorrow's video about how the skyports kind of organize themselves, but I want to kind of introduce them to you because these are the main figures that we meet when we're talking about how Kharadron Overlords relate to the kind of Grand Alliance of Order. And they also kind of give us a sense of how the race itself has evolved and split up and resplit up across the realms. So we're going to introduce the skyports right now, starting with Barak Urbaz. And they are by far the most commercial of any sky fleet. They have a heavy emphasis on trade and transportation. Making deals with them is super treacherous because, as we're talking about exploiting loopholes, these guys do it to the next level. And part of what has grown them so well in terms of trade and commerce is that they have secured extremely profitable fishing rights when it comes to the code and kind of how those rights work. In addition to that, they also have their own network of realm gates they know about where they can easily get to their fishing zones, back, and trade and transport, really without the other skyports knowing. So if you're looking for an emphasis on that commerce side and how they fit into the grander narrative of the setting, this is definitely the skyport for you. Next is Barak Mornar, and this sky fleet hails from the realm of shadows, and as their ships move, a darkness kind of clings to them. And you can really think of them to put them as the most piratey, if you will, of skyports, because they're often labeled as pirates and privateers by the other ones. And they're really known for kind of their guile and their sneakiness in deals, and so much to the point where different amendments to the code have been made specifically because some crew from Barak Mornar was being a turd about some deal, and they had to kind of revise the way the entire faction operates to kind of cut out the seedy underdeals of these guys. Now, their skyport is also a hub of illicit commerce. The kinds of items, supplies, and such that the other skyports just won't or do not deliver on. Kind of think of these guys, if you're in prison, there's always that one kind of stereotypical prisoner who can quote-unquote get you things. That's pretty much what this entire skyport is, and I absolutely love it. Next up is Barak Zilfin, and this is the home and kind of home base for all engineers and ace pilots. Few fleets can match the technological prowess of Barak Zilfin. Put simply, they have two things going for them. The best pilots in the skies, able to survive longer and go further from the port than any others, and a top-notch engineering school. They turn out more ships and newer designs faster than anyone else. So if you want to lean into the science and technology of things, Zilfin is a great way to go. Then there's Barak Thring, I believe that's how you pronounce that. And this is basically the skyport of grumpy old men. These are Kharadron Overlords that still revere and cling to the old ways. Some of them still venerate the old gods. They hate seeing amendments and changes being made to the code because really they just fundamentally believe that things change too much and that the original structure that we had before was the best means of survival. Now, they don't necessarily want to go back to the ground per se, but just don't like the way that the race as a whole is evolving. It's too rapid for them. And that really kind of is their unique outlook and that separates them from other skyports. Next up is Barak Zon, and this is the oldest of these skyports. It's often called the City of the Sun, because when light reflects off of it, it glows super hot red. And the Kharadron Overlord here focus on martial prowess and really revere military exploits. They decorate the skyport with memorials of great battles they've won, big trophies, all that kind of stuff, statues, memorials, all kind of displaying like not only did we survive the Age of Chaos, but we're triumphing in kind of that self-revelry. And the last one is Barak Nar, and this is the most successful of all skyports, because they are highly practical and not superstitious at all. They invest heavily in scientific research and development. They maybe don't have as big of an engineering school as others, but there's all kinds of sciences to invest in, and their innovations have really helped it accrue great wealth. Additionally, it's also a place that great leaders tend to come from. They're of high moral character, very pragmatic, intelligent, quick-witted, And really, they were one of the focal points of how Kharadron Overlords got to be such a vital, important part of the Grand Alliance Order, because no other Skyfleet was as aggressive when it came to seeking trade with non-Kharadron Overlords. And those are the major skyports. Now, there are smaller ones scattered across the realms, but these really are the big ones that we see in the book, and that really characterize the faction. And as you can see, they have all kind of taken different aspects of the original survival instincts that we talked about. Some leaned into commerce, about how can we meet each other's needs and be profitable about it. Others are science and technology. Some don't like the advancement at all. Some of them are kind of underhanded and sneaky. You get the sense that this kind of, you can see how all of these different worldviews and developments can all spawn from the same point. That same origin story we talked about yesterday can all reasonably make these different skyports, and I really do appreciate about the lore. So friends, those are the facts about the Kharadron Overlords today, what they are currently like, kind of their main worldviews as far as technology, engineering, and the commerce side of things, and how those are played out across the major skyports. We're going to explore this structure a little bit more and start diving into the units in tomorrow's video when we talk about the officers in charge. In yesterday's video, we got a glimpse of what the Kharadron Overlords are like now. They are essentially governed by commerce and ether gold. And today we're going to explore what that looks like as a society and introduce the officers and leaders who make it possible. Now, if you didn't catch it earlier, these skyports are basically giant businesses. All the language and structure and the terms that the Battle Tome uses to describe how people fit into society are all business terms. Commerce and technology were the saviors in the Age of Chaos. So we're going to touch on the anatomy of a skyport. And it dovetails really nicely into the leadership and how they kind of fit into this faction. So let's just pick one as an example. You have a skyport, we'll say Barak Mornar, which is my favorite one. The one from the Realm of Shadows. A skyport is composed of many guilds. These are things like workers' unions, skyfleet, so people who like a union based around the ships and piloting them, engineers, flight schools, colleges of technology, things like that. Basically a conglomerate of businesses or mutual interests that unify is what a guild is. The leaders from the biggest guilds come in and they sit on a council seat, and that's really how the governorship of a skyport functions. And which one is in charge, meaning like which guild is the biggest, varies from skyport to skyport, but fundamentally they all operate that same way. Regardless of how different they are in every skyport, there are three big ones that really stand out in every single one of them. The first one being the Nav League, NAV, and these are your navigators. Incredibly important for the amount of travel that the Kharadron Overlords do, because they really are the cartographers, or they map out the way that the skies work. Different pressures at different altitudes, wind currents, obviously mountains and things that touch the sky become very important. They study storm patterns, and they use the current of the skies to kind of expedite travel or circumvent their enemies. And these are complex mathematical calculations that are done on a whim that few can do, particularly while you're in a storm clinging to the side of a ship. Next up are the Ether Chemist Guild, and these are scientists and engineers that focused almost exclusively on the study of ether gold and other kind of alchemical properties. Because ether gold is a substance that's difficult to find and hard to mine, so having someone who can track it, extract it, store it, grade it is incredibly important with how vital that substance is. Now, keep in mind their main focus is on ether gold, but they do have access and study into a lot of other materials like developing stronger and thicker alloys for their ships' hulls, other power sources, things like that. So they really do have a wide variety. It really is just a focus on like chemical science, if you will. And the third one here is the Engineers Guild. Now, these are the most mechanically inclined minds of this race. These are scientists and engineers that focus almost exclusively on ships and the development of new engines. These are the innovators of the race, and they focus on bigger, larger, more efficient designs, which also includes new ways to use, store, and transport ether gold, weapons, creations, defenses, things like that. And while Barak Zilfin boasts the largest Engineers Guild, as we spoke about yesterday, every port has a vital one. They're all vitally important. Now, all these guilds work together, of course, for a fee for each one of them to make society happen. So now we're going to dive into the hero units of the Battletome, and we'll see how each guild lends its services to any sky fleet, fleet being just a collection of ships that go out for any reason. And they're going to act as advisors, crews, officers, anything they can do to be of assistance to the fleet as well as rake in personal profit. Now we're going to hammer through these units here. Most of them have very, very little lore individually, but we're going to kind of go through them and talk about why they are so cool. The first up is the Arkanaut Admiral. This is the highest level of leadership on the table, the one that we can literally play in the game. Every ship has a captain, but a fleet, meaning a collection of ships, has an admiral. And he is the undisputed leader on the battlefield. They are masters of maneuvers, warfare, commerce, and wealth. They have no ship of their own, but they elect one ship in their fleet to be their flagship, to act as their home base. Now, to become an admiral, you actually have to be chosen by a special council back at the skyport. That conglomeration of guilds has to agree that this person, this Dwarden, is the best person for the job to achieve X goal. Because they have to be shrewd and practical and efficient and brutal and successful. And part of that is the fact that, much like all Dwarden leadership, they don't lead from the rear. They use their wealth and influence to outfit themselves with the finest armor and weapons that money can buy. And so instead of giving orders from a cabin as he kind of coordinates where his ships are, these guys are on the bow pointing at the enemy, directing things from the front. Next up is the Ether Chemist, and then this is the representative of the Ether Chemist Guild. And this is their on-site expert on Ether Gold. He helps make expeditions more profitable and therefore more successful. Again, having someone who is really good at finding and harvesting your vital resource is incredibly important. So he might seem like a side character, but he is extremely vital to the way this faction operates. Now, he's not only an expert, as I said before, in Ether Gold, but in pretty much the chemical properties of just about everything. He can rip the air from enemies' lungs or shoot gouts of poison at them with his little backpack. Next is the Engine Master. Now, this is the field mechanic from the Engineers Guild. And they're able to strip and reassemble an ether engine mid-battle in the sky, and they keep the fleets moving and flying and attacking. Should anyone try to get near them, they're in for a world of hurt because he has this massive hammer that's usually used for smashing pieces back into place, but of course, it tends to silence any enemies that annoy him. And lastly are the Etheric Navigators. As I said before, from the Nav League Guild, this is the cartographers of the sky, and they make the travel on the winds as safe and efficient as possible. They can even use technology to alter the winds themselves to use against an enemy. And these are really just more advisory roles that really assist the Admiral in making efficient decisions on the battlefield and just traveling and making commerce happen. Now, honestly, that's about it for the lore on the leaders. I'll do a special video for a hero that has a name at another time, but why are these characters specifically cool? Well, simply put, there are few books that bring the lore to the tabletop like Kharadron Overlords, specifically in regards to heroes. I really do encourage you to read the Battletome for yourself. It has a ton more detail about organizational structure and how each guild fits into society and how leaders are elected and the demands that are placed upon them. It's all very fascinating. When we read about a faction that uses commerce as its lifeblood, we actually get to see all the elements come together on the tabletop, right? You got your admiral of the fleet, but he needs to have a navigator, needs to pay to have someone help him literally get to the ether gold so he can get paid. Okay, well, if you're going that far, you want to have the best chances of getting the most amount of money and profit, so you have to hire an ether chemist. And doing all of those things, you're going to, of course, accrue mechanical needs and expenses and that, so you get an engineer. And so you can just kind of see, even just from a cursory glance at the faction, why all these pieces are here and how they all work together. Again, I said commerce sprung in this faction because need breeds opportunity. They're all helping each other, of course, for a cost, but they are all working together. And they can't do each other's jobs, they need each other. And they all mutually benefit from it. Each one of these heroes, even though they're kind of getting paid to be there and they have their own thoughts and goals and things like that, they all have their own risk and reward and a market built around their skills. And I just feel like so few races integrate that well on the tabletop. It makes perfect sense to have a full set of leaders in an ironclad on the tabletop, or multiple of a particular type depending on your port of choice. Regardless, these are also some killer models. I particularly love the Admiral. Absolutely gorgeous model. And so seeing that they put this much thought into how the guilds exist and then also work together and how they send representatives and hire each other out is just a really fun, fascinating thing to dig into, and I do encourage you to do the same. But friends, that is all there is on the leadership. There's very few units in this faction, and so these little videos where I cover basically the units, it's going to go very, very quickly. In yesterday's video, we explored the heroes and leaders of the Sky Fleet. Those individuals who come from guilds and the higher echelon of societies to make the Kharadron Overlords possible. Well, in today's video, we're going to look a bit further down the totem pole and examine the troops that make this a functioning army. Heroes alone don't win battles. And a ship is nothing without its crew, and that's really exemplified in these units. And without further ado, we're just going to dive straight in and talk about the Arkanaut company. This is the most basic troop type and by far the most numerous. And it's easy to mistake these guys for being basic crew members, kind of like how we think about on traditional ships, that they're kind of the dregs society, you stuff them in a boat, and they're just laborers, which is true to an extent, but to become part of an Arkanaut company actually takes tremendous skill. When the Great Exodus went on and they all left the Earth, the realms, solid ground, and went up to the skies, ships and their crews were largely split up by clans, those little links of lineages and families that bound together, as you might expect from Dwarden, and certainly the way they used to be underground. But with the coming of the Code, all of that changed. They radically changed the way their society works from being a lineage structure, meaning it matters who your relatives were and their deeds and accomplishments, to everything being very merit-based. You need to earn everything as an individual. If you want a cut of the tremendous wealth that working on one of these ships and vessels can get you, you need to prove that you can handle the work. So what they do is a big tournament is held in Chaman, where aspirants prove their skills. And they prove their skills as a few things, like as deckhands, the literal rigging and how to work and use the machines, proven themselves as fighters because they will be on the ground. Again, these are the basic troops. These are the boots on the ground, claim objectives, smash in, grab precious resources, and leave. They need to be good at rappelling, working in flying conditions, all that stuff. And those who do really well are offered contracts amongst the Sky Fleet. They just handpick the best and the brightest to become Arkanaut company from amongst the masses of Kharadron Overlords. And as a side note, if you enter into this competition and 3 times you try and get passed over every single time, you still work as a deckhand, but basically you're more relegated to like a fisherman or any one of the port or harbor jobs, something a little bit lower class. But the Arkanaut company really are the elite of fishermen and deckhands. And to kind of put it in perspective, this is a hard job to do because you're in a state of perpetual motion. You work long days in cramped quarters. Weather and flying beasts are a constant threat, like literally the elements of cold up in the upper parts of the atmosphere, your skin getting like wind bitten, storms, big wind gusts, things like that are all extremely dangerous. And to compensate for that, they wear big, heavy armor which protects them, but also kind of hinders their movement a bit. So even so, they're able to work quite rapidly and get their job done. They are the first troops on the ground when a position needs to be held, and that makes them absolutely vital to the army. Next up are the Grundstock Thunderers. Now, where the Arkanaut company are the general crew that is always kind of ready for combat, they're trained in combat, but they are also crew members to do day-to-day tasks. Grundstock Thunderers are dedicated military units. This is the unit that you bring, the formation you take with you as an admiral when you're not just fishing, you know you're going to be fighting. There is an entire academy system dedicated to training these troops. Remember, we were talking about the guilds, how it's just kind of a conglomeration of dedicated and focused businesses on how to create troops for a certain role in the society. Well, there is an entire academy dedicated to their military class. It's, of course, called the Grundstock Academy, which is not super clever, but it gets the point across, and they learn all manner of firearm design, maintenance, and use. And as such, they come to battle absolutely loaded to the gills with the best weapons money can buy. They got ether shot rifles, which basically takes energy from the wind, condenses it into a physical projectile, and launches it at the enemy. They have cannons, which are just larger caliber versions of the same thing. The fumigators belch out toxic mist at the enemy, which is huge if you think about it, more so than just Nurgle barfing, green mist in the air. Like, if you think about a faction that understands wind currents and uses those as a weapon, the fumigator becomes a really cool thematic thing. There's also the deck sweeper, which is basically a shotgun that is just absolutely off the rails, and the mortar, which lobs incendiary rounds in high arcs at the enemy. And this is really their devotion to science and skill and ingenuity being weaponized, and it's absolutely terrifying. In addition to all these different weapons, they also often have a standard bearer, which kind of recounts their mighty deeds, and he kind of keeps track of all the battles they've won and things like that. Now, the thing about this is, we talked about how when the code came about, there was a clean slate, there's no clans, so you would think that they would kind of move away from the idea of kind of keeping track of their big accomplishments in battle. But here's the thing, all of these elements that we're talking about have to be hired individually. So if you have a group of Grundstock Thunderers that have kept good records of what they've accomplished, that actually acts as a resume for admirals who are hiring supporting fire for their fleet. And so it's kind of interesting that when you talk about the change from what Dwarden or dwarves used to be, keeping long records of all their accomplishments and grudges and like that, and how that translate when commerce and science are the thing. Like, it's a resume. It's what it is, and it's such a cool transition. Their firepower and discipline in combat is legendary, and they truly makes them a unit desired by any admiral. Next up, we're going to talk about the skyrigger units. Now, the term skyrigger is a kind of a catch-all term to describe a few different kinds of units. What unifies them are the large ether engine backpacks that give them all flight. These are the guys who are suspended by the big metal balloon. These personal flight packs have a variety of uses, but the big two come down to practicality for internal use or used in a military or aggressive manner, and that's what we'll talk about with these units. Starting with the engine riggers. The engine is needed to let them fly around the ship and make repairs. This is the practical internal use. As the ships suffer damage to the hull or to the weapons outside, being able to move around the ship in 3 dimensions freely anytime you need to do repairs is paramount. Because remember, you're suspended in the air, so if you get shot on the bottom of your hull, this is how you get to it. They report directly to the captain of the ship and also any engine masters nearby. Each one of them carries a rapid-fire rivet gun and a huge saw. And this is ideal for making quick repairs. If something on the ship is damaged, they can easily cut out a section around it, slap on a new piece of metal, and then rapid-fire rivet it back into place. These are the units I talked about yesterday where they can strip an engine and reassemble it back in no time. Really just kind of your on-site battle mechanics. And of course, if the enemy gets a little too close for comfort, the saw and rapid-fire rivet gun make excellent weapons as a storm of rapid-firing hot bolts of metal just hail at the enemy. And next up is the Sky Wardens. This is the other skyrigger unit, and these are really drawn from the most elite crew of the Arkanaut company. They are another warrior kind of focus. Their primary role is to protect the larger ships from chaff or boarding parties, anything like that. So what they'll do is be deployed to kind of keep little harassers away from bigger ships. They can move as they need to. And they'll come in and blast enemies with their pistol before charging in with a sky pike. And again, this is the military end of using that same technology of a personal jetpack, really. And it focuses on mobility and uses hit and run tactics. Oftentimes they'll strike hard coming in with that pistol, and again the sky hook, or a pike I should say, smash an enemy, really pinning them down, and then scatter away, going straight to the next enemy. Now, one thing they also do when they scatter away is they'll drop mines behind them. So they'll pick you off the side of the ship, drop a mine, and all of a sudden they're just not there when it goes off. Essentially, this makes them like a flying light cavalry unit, if you will. Come in, deal damage, and then jump to the next target. Now, one of the cool rules that made it from lore into the game is that these little personal jetpacks, right, the little ether engines they're connected to, really do have their own battery life, and so to conserve energy in the lore, they'll hook themselves to the side of the ship, and they'll kind of conserve that power until it's needed. And this is actually something you can do in the game. You can have the little dudes hook into the sides of your ships thematically and bring them to the combat, or at least closer to the enemy. Now, honestly, that's it. There's just 4 units, not a ton of lore on each of them individually, but I want to talk a bit about what makes them all interesting. And I love a few things. One, I love that they take the time to acknowledge the way Dwarden used to be, or at least traditionally used to be in the old world, in terms of organizing by clans and their personal achievements for glory and their grudges and things like that, but they've just reimagined it in a few ways. First one being that they negated all of that when they made the code. In the Arkanaut company section, they talk specifically about how everything's merit-based now. We need to move away from that, but still retaining the fact that, okay, accomplishments do matter, and so how that plays out in the Grunstock Thunders is they do have a record keeper, but again, like I said, it now becomes more of a resume rather than a reputation that should precede you, and everyone should worship the ground you walk on. Or the clouds you sail in, I suppose. That kind of evolution of taking old bits, reworking them so that they can fit with our modern life, right? All hands on deck, doesn't matter what you were before. No one cares that you used to be a king. You're a deckhand now because titles don't matter, lineage doesn't matter. But at the same time, when you do accomplish something, it does make you stand out as a better hire for some of these fleets, and therefore it is important again. One other thing that I've been really thinking about is this weekend, Games Workshop released images for the new warband in Night Vault for Dark Oath, the Chaos Marauder types that seem to be undivided, which I'm absolutely a fan of. But the thing is that they look so primitive. They have furs and leather straps and bones all over them. They look very, very primal. And I think to myself, it just kind of dawned on me, and I know it's dawned on people before, how different and striking this army is in comparison to most Age of Sigmar factions. Most factions are pretty primitive. I mean, they use magics in really cool ways, but like even the established ones of Tzeentch and Sylvaneth and Stormcast, for the most part, before the last round came out, undead things, they all look very like different levels of primitive, up to including like medieval type stuff. Like it's all swords and weapons and Warhammers with that. And then you just have this thing like the sky tears open and colossal ironclads and all these ships are flying at you, and you got little personal balloon guys sailing in between all of them, making sure no one gets too close or doing repairs. It must be absolutely astounding looking. And so I don't know why, when I was reading this particular section on the troops, really going through the Sky Wardens, it kind of dawned on me, I was like, what would this look like to those primitive factions that I see when I look at the other models? And it has to be an extremely cool thing. So friends, tell me your thoughts on the units here. I know a lot of us were really expecting for Grunstock Thunders to become Battle Line If in the newest General's Handbook, but I want to hear your thoughts on Arkanaut Company, Grunstock Thunders, and both Skyrigger units. Tell me this, what do you like more, Engine Riggers or Sky Wardens? Because I've seen some pretty great debates online. Thematically, I think they're both great. I love the idea of mechanics in an army, like repairing things mid-battle. And so thematically, I would probably go with Engine Riggers just because I think that's super dope. But the idea of them all hooking onto the side of the ship and coming in, entering the battle that way as you set up your models, but of course thematically that's when they just burst in from the sky, looks fantastic, and I want to hear your thoughts about it. So in yesterday's video, we met the crew and soldiers that make up the boots on the ground of a fleet. Those brave and weathered souls that take ground and resources from the enemy. But today, we're going to talk about the most iconic part of the Kharadron Overlords, the ships themselves. Models that stunned the wargaming community when they were debuted. Now there's not a ton of them, so I'll end the video just chatting about why I've enjoyed learning about Kharadron Overlords a bit, and we're going to start talking about the ships going from smallest to biggest. I'm going to start with the Grundstock Gun Hauler. Now this is another little technological marvel from the Grundstock Academy. If you remember from yesterday, the Grunstock Thunderers is kind of a college, if you will, dedicated to military warfare and the use of weapons. And they're really the dedicated military branch of the faction. And they've come up with a very cool design for a ship. It's an extremely light aircraft piloted by only 2 Kharadron Overlords, and they're designed to dart and weave between the larger ships. And really they have 2 major roles: to take out smaller threats and targets so that the larger ships can focus on prime targets. So whatever the boss is, that's what the big guns need to be focused on. Let the gunstock grunt haulers go ahead and take out the smaller chaff units coming in. The second part is to intercept incoming fire from enemies. It's hard to fathom, but they really do act as sort of a quote-unquote meat shield for the defense of the frigates and the ironclad. This is something that translates from lore to tabletop as well. You can pass wounds over to the gruntstock gun hauler because that's what they're there to do. Realistically, think of them as jet fighters and meat shields combined. They're light, fast, and agile. Really, they're a big gun platform. It's those 2 guys on the ship, and really it's realistically just a big gun with an engine built around it to kind of keep it in the air. Not really built for long, sustained flight, but it is an important part of the army. Now, the next ship, going from smallest to biggest, is the Arkanaut frigate. And these are the true backbone of the entire Kharadron Overlord faction, because no other ship has been designed, redesigned, and overgunned and produced as much as an Arkanaut frigate. They embody the role and look of the Kharadron Overlords. An interesting fact is that they really have a small cargo bay, and that's, for a very practical race, actually a very big deal. Other ships dedicated to mining or fishing can hold several times as much material and stuff as this frigate can, but this is actually what makes the Arkanaut frigate unique, because it sacrifices that space for incredible engines and weapon platforms. Because those other ships are incredibly slow, but relative to them, the frigate is lightning fast, and it has a massive armament to boot. So even though he's not carrying a lot of cargo, this is a ship that you'll see quite a bit defending a trade route. He's defending the people who are carrying the cargo. He can be leading a caravan and some such things. Now, it's loaded to the gills with weapons, as I said before. And if something gets too close to it, it can even launch detonation drills, kind of obliterates everything nearby. And to see this kind of huge weapon platform coming from the sky with skyriggers attached to the side of it and gun haulers circling, this is kind of what it means to know fear in the mortal realms. Now, lastly is the Arkanaut Ironclad. And this is it. This is the big daddy of modern Kharadron Overlord aircraft. Here's the thing. There's a constant balance between how much weight an engine can carry and how much costs there are involved in resources to keep it going and maintenance to use such an engine. So because of that, you get this like sliding scale where there's really an upper limit to how big an aircraft can be based on how efficient your engines are. However, the Ironclad exists due to continued advancements in that engineering technology, because this is the largest kind of mass-produced ether ship available. Now here's the thing, I say mass-produced, they don't produce a lot of them, they're very rare, but it's the same template that you can find across multiple skyports is what I'm trying to say. In addition, there are actually bigger ships that are mentioned. The thing is that they are really just one-offs. They're one of a kind. Anything bigger than this requires special dedication of resources, things like that. And so it's very, very rare to have anything larger than an Ironclad. But even then, the Ironclad is the largest kind of thing you'll see uniformly around the different skyports. And very few are ever made because it takes massive amounts of resources to construct each one of them. It has custom engines, prototype weaponry, reinforced hulls twice over. And all these things come together to make the Ironclad a truly mobile fortress. And this also means that if you lose one in battle, it is absolutely devastating. But with the design given, it's rarely that it happens. Now, with the frigate, we said that it sacrifices cargo space. The Ironclad doesn't. It can hold a full military campaign worth of food, water, and cargo, the best haul from a mining expedition you can imagine, or an entire company of soldiers if they're going specifically on a military exercise. And it really is engineering and destruction given form, with its sky cannon, carbines, mines, torpedoes, crews on the deck shooting out, skyriggers attached to it. This is going to be like the epicenter of devastation when you fight a sky fleet. And to back it all up, it has an absolutely stunning model. So backing away from the ships, because that's really it for all of them, and they really are fantastic, and they, for only being 3 models, they add so much to this model range as well as the game as a whole. But I want to back away and just talk about Kharadron Overlords in general, because this is one of those factions that people want to play because the models are so astounding. Now, I have never claimed to be a competitive list-minded guy, but I've been told they're kind of in a rough place rules-wise, and I think part of that is because the game has just kind of evolved around them. The truth of the matter is, I think this faction will make its day in the comeback here. What I think really they need to focus on is the ability to maximize shooting and mobility, because those two hand-in-hand are very, very interesting. The thing is, when I picture this army descending from the clouds, I think of something that moves incredibly fast, and they probably use a lot of technological stuff to get you away and off objectives, but they don't have a whole lot of melee capabilities to back it up, which I'm sure most people can agree that's not really how they play. What seems to be the issue is they don't do the mobile shooting platform as well as some other armies can probably. That being said, no matter how effective they are, I do believe they do a great job of taking the lore that I just talked about this week and putting it on the tabletop, and it's always those little things that make, bring a lore to the tabletop. By that I mean the skyriggers hooking into the side of the boat. That is so cool. Or the fact that all the leaders are from different guilds and they can all be represented in your fleet is astounding to me. The way that the Arkanaut company is kind of the crew and the deckhand and kind of the mining equipment look that they all have, and it makes a lot of sense. The fact that they would have special sciences and academies dedicated to specific things, like the Grundstock Academy for all the Thunderers and the Gun Haulers and stuff like that. And even just the way they kind of structure their ships, where you have a big capital ship like the Ironclad, some more battleship level type stuff, and then smaller things to keep smaller enemies at bay and just be more maneuverable. All of it just makes absolute sense when you read the stories, and then when you see it on the tabletop, you're like, oh, okay, that just translates seamlessly, and I absolutely love it. For being a completely new faction they kind of just made one week, it kind of seems that way, it kind of came out unexpected, they kind of harken back to a lot of the old world things that we would know as dwarves or Dwarden that I really found interesting. I talked before about how there's no more lineage system. It doesn't matter who your father and father were, what they did. It matters your personal merit, and then you can display your personal merit like the Grundstock Thunderers do, but that functionally is just a resume. That's a good hearkening and reimagining of how lineage stuff used to work. Likewise, taking the things that old world dwarves to focus on, like gyrocopters and having good weapons and technology and engineering, and just taking that to the absolute extreme has been so interesting that I've absolutely loved it. And one more thing that I really do love about this faction is, and it's something that I touched on when I did my last video, is there are very few armies in this game that are godless. And by that I mean you have most armies are dedicated heart and soul to a god or a deity of their choosing. Some armies have like multiple gods, so you can have like the Sylvaneth who revere Kurnoth as well as Alariel, or you have, everyone in order just kind of has some reverence towards Sigmar. Legions of Nagash, they're all just Nagash is one, all are Nagash kind of thing. But then you get here and it's like, they acknowledge that the gods exist, but they just had nothing to do with them. We just do our own thing. You know what I mean? It's kind of interesting. I didn't know they were going to go that route, and I found that particularly fascinating because I don't think I've seen a faction that in their lore emphasizes self-reliance. There's no prayers, there's no, a deity going to come save you, nothing like that. This is just, I've got me, I've got my boat, and I've got my gun, and that's all I need, and I absolutely love it. It's very, very different. And in a setting that revolves around the toils of gods and men and demigods and all those things, having this faction stand out and be like, I don't care what any of you guys want, we're on our own. It's a big middle finger to that whole narrative, and I absolutely think they have a place in this world. The next nearest thing I can think of is probably like Slaanesh, who they're godless, but they know their god exists, he's just locked away somewhere. But to truly reject the pantheon in favor of self-reliance and your own intellect and your own ingenuity and designs is truly different. It's what sets them apart. I'm very interested to see how something like Clan Scryer for Skaven kind of compares to these when you have two factions that are very mechanical based and very design scientific intensive. Of course, the Skaven one's going to be much more like ramshackle and stuff like that, and that's great. Totally different look, and I think it's going to have a lot of different feels. But I love the idea of bringing high levels of technology and self-reliance into the Mortal Realms. So friends, those are all my thoughts and more on the Kharadron Overlords, and I want to hear your opinion on the army. Particularly as we wrap up here, tell me why they struggle so much in, say, matched play. And the reason I ask that question is because I frankly don't know. I have yet to actually play someone who plays Kharadron Overlords. I know Brent and everyone else has an army, but he hasn't finished painting or assembling them yet. And there's no pressure on that, but I just haven't actually seen someone play them. So I'd love to know why. And also I want to hear what you love about the army. If you're someone who plays them regardless of effectiveness, I want to hear all about that because that's the kind of stuff that I love to talk about. To me, passion and lore trumps effectiveness on the tabletop. Games Workshop was kind enough to send me an advanced copy of their new Battle Tome for 2nd edition, and that's what I'm diving into in this video. Now, this video is going to be building upon a series that I did for Kharadron Overlords a while back, and I'll leave a link in the description down below for you, though I will admit I've considered redoing it because I've improved my craft as speedsmanship and also just technical stuff like a new mic and things like that along the way. But for today's purposes, a great deal of the core history and drama surrounding that faction can be found in that video series. So this is something that interests you, go check those out for sure. In short, the Kharadron Overlords are a faction of Dwarden, traditionally known as dwarves, who escaped the Age of Chaos by using their superior flight technology to ascend to the skies far above the reaches of the initial Chaos forces. However, this was far from safe, and they are constantly hunting and mining new sources of their fuel, ether gold, which is kind of a cloud-like substance that they can use to power all of the anti-gravitational stuff they need to stay in the air. They've developed a highly complex society based around what they call the Code, a set of laws that dictates nearly every aspect of Kharadron Overlord life. This code keeps their entire empire on the same page and has built a government based on commerce and personal achievement. And that is the short of it, right? The elevator pitch for the Kharadron Overlords. If you want to know more, go ahead and, like I said, check out those videos in the link down below. Their origin story about going into the skies initially is probably one of my favorite tales in Age of Sigmar. But with every 2nd edition Battle Tome, Games Workshop has done a few things. They've added how the necroquake affected the faction, and really taken the chance to fine-tune their lore, and they really delivered in this book. In fact, when we're talking about books that their lore really got reworked in a way that makes it more exciting to learn about, I have to say this is one of my top contenders for best 2nd edition Battle Tomes out there. Let's start with the more concrete lore stuff. There's a few things I want to touch on that aren't necessarily, as I would say, concrete. The necroquake was a setting-wide event where Nagash, god of undeath, attempted a massive ritual to basically kill everyone and raise them as undead under his command. It largely failed, but not completely. It still, totally disrupted the nature of magic within the realms. It gave us endless spells and raised thousands of restless dead under no control across the realms, and it was the birth of the Night Haunt faction. So really this event was world-shaping, a pivotal moment that touched the lives of every person in the mortal realms, either directly or indirectly. And all of the 2nd edition Battle Tomes have had a section on how this event affects them. And I like it. It's a direct reason for escalation and tension, and a chance to include everyone in the grand story instead of saying oh, and these guys, they're also here, right? Without any real connection to the grand story arc of Age of Sigmar. Now, the Kharadron Overlords have a unique name for the necroquake. They, in their own society, call it the Garaktorman. And it's a huge event in their history. The sheer shockwave of magical energy that burst from Shyish sent ripples in every single realm, including Chaman, the realm of metal, which is the home of the Kharadron Overlords. Now, oftentimes the book describes Kharadron Overlord flight as if they use nautical term like trade routes, and they describe pathways in the skies as currents, the wind is kind of operating kind of like a current in the ocean type stuff, all of that. So this event is equivalent. I'm gonna back away and use real world examples here for us. It's the equivalent of a tsunami coming in, crashing against all of their ports, and spread around the realm, right? It's just this huge thing. But imagine a tsunami so big that it changed the way the ocean worked, okay, in our real world. Think about that for a second. Imagine a wave of such magnitude that it sunk huge land masses, it reversed rivers, mountains became islands, but also at the same time, huge stretches of land that were long underwater broke up and jetted into the surface. Ocean currents displaced or reversed entire coral reef shoals, moved hundreds of miles. You get the idea of what I'm saying. When the intensity of the necroquake descended upon Chaman, that happened to the Kharadron Overlords. Ships were knocked out of harbor and often annihilated, torn to shreds by the sheer force beating upon them. Safe travel routes became epicenters of carnage as the realms tore apart. The relative safety of the skyports was tested. Even their mind-bending size offered no firm ground. Right? Buildings collapsed, citizens were bucked off the side of it, meaning they just literally got jetted off into nothing. In addition to that, colossal night haunt processions crashed into them because the night haunt don't think you're special because you can fly. And so they're reeling from what is essentially an earthquake/tsunami, and they're trying to rally a defense against an invader. And this is interesting to think about when you're a faction that's, you survived this long because nobody could reach you, but instantly there's an army on your doorstep. No one could see any of this coming. So all in all, we can agree this was a bad day to be a Kharadron Overlord. In fact, one of the darkest in their history. There's no definitive number to the death toll in the book. Ragnars does their own kind of investigation and estimated that 1/5 of its ships and army were wiped out instantly. And when you're talking something that's supposed to be almost like its own nation unto itself, 1/5 just being deleted is almost unimaginable. In addition to that, a new threat began to prowl the skies. Endless spells. Semi-sentient conjurations of magic roamed the clouds. Usually, magic, if you made some kind of magical casting at somebody, it would dissipate naturally, but the necroquake broke the laws of what we would call physics, but in their thing is magic, around. So now all of a sudden these spells, they don't go away, they just keep going. And there's a few blurbs of endless spells causing trouble for the Kharadron Overlords, and my personal favorite is that there's a ship from Barak Zilfin, it's their flagship called the Sunderer, and it gets cut in half from an ether void pendulum. And the whole thing just toppled in twain to the ground below. Now I go through all of this detail to really emphasize that this event, it broke their world, right? Their own personal world that they understood was just coming apart at the seams. Because when the dust settled, the initial lash of energy had passed, the Kharadron Overlords looked outside of their skyports and saw the devastation around them. And going back to our tsunami, right, that changes how the ocean works, the skies of the realm of metal were changed completely. Long-claimed ether gold deposits were broken up, tossed around, moved incredible distances, new caches were revealed, long-held mining operations left without an owner, and in this near destruction of a faction, opportunity had revealed itself. There was a huge portion of the code dedicated to mining rights. Of course, this makes perfect sense. Who owns what the charges for poaching are, claiming new veins of ether gold, all these things. Well, this event knocked away all of the reasonable claims to existing ether gold. If you had a mine, but now all of a sudden the gold that was in that mine, let's say from our tsunami or a big, theoretical earthquake, all that gold inside that mine gets thrown 20 miles away, what's to say that that gold is yours, right? Because you owned the mine, you owned the land, but you didn't claim the gold inside of it. Now that gold's somewhere else. You don't have claim over that. Who's to say that's the same gold from the mine that you used to own? You claim this space over there that now has nothing. And so they're in this weird position where on one hand you have absolute tragedy, right? A crushing blow to any faction to lose 1/5 of your fighting strength, of your might, of your technological superiority. It's huge. But there's also this kickoff to the greatest gold rush in Kharadron Overlord history. Because all the veins that were previously claimed were done so over time, right? All these things happened over the hundreds of years between their founding of their faction to the now. They were keeping the society going and slowly expanding outwards. Some families had their companies and lineage built upon these huge, reliable veins of ether gold, and the technology to harvest it better and better had evolved over time. But now, instead of all those discoveries and innovations happening over time, they have skyports full of top-of-the-line ships, no claims on any gold, and it's open season. So the effects of this event are obviously direct, but one of the indirect ones is the colossal shift in their economics and lifestyle. So this faction is now like spreading far and wide, it's like a gold rush. Like I said, they're trying to claim every single thing they can. Long-standing companies based upon reliable wealth have been shifted, so maybe they are losing money now because they have all these ships, but they don't have any claims on ether gold, whereas some of the smaller companies might be rising in power as they were the first ones to claim it. It's a big mix-up. And I find that all incredibly interesting. And if you go watch those videos I did about Kharadron Overlords, you know that this is actually a really big deal for them and their society. But now I want to move away. Like that's like the real concrete addition to this book. A lot of the character entries and the unit entries and the kind of overall feel of the faction remains relatively the same. But there's something about the book that isn't, concrete, it's not a straight addition to the book. It's the subtle things that bring the faction to life. And there's really two of them that I want to focus on. One of them is that the book really has a much more interesting take on the code, right, segments of it, and then also focusing on businesses. So we'll start off with the code. This is a huge part of their lore, as I mentioned before, and in other videos. This document that keeps their society together and governs all aspects of their life and their worldview. But in the older book, we got snippets of the lore here and there. It was like little blurbs between lore entries and that kind of thing, but it didn't feel totally immersive. It was a few things taken out of context. But in this book, this new second edition Battletome, there's actually a 2-page spread of articles, amendments, and footnotes, and they range from declarations of war to what is basically alcohol quality control. And I want to read to you my favorite. So this is Article 3, the Articles of Justice, point 5. All Haskell brewed, a Haskell being a Dwarden ale brewed and fermented over a course of many wind cycles. So, all Haskell brewed within a skyport is subject to regular inspection to be carried out by the Board of Brewmasters. Any guild company found guilty of thinning their product with bilge water, using inferior hops, or failing to allow appropriate fermentation time shall be fined to the full extent of the code permits, and its owners debearded and branded with the mark of the Guzengrim. Now, that's hilarious that there's actually laws based around how good your alcohol has to be, but down below that is Amendment 21 footnote 6. Brewing stations located within the high airs cannot be subject to point 5 of this article, the point we just read. In addition, the sale of inferior Haskell within foreign ports shall be permitted because the Umgi, humans, are content to drink any old swill. And that's an amendment proposed by Captain Magbeth Isram of Barak Mornar. And I think that's hilarious, right? We're going to have quality control laws for the alcohol that everyone drinks. But hey, let's make an amendment because you know what? We can still sell bad alcohol. We just sell it to humans who don't know any better. I love that. I think that that's hilarious. Now, there's actually also like trade embargoes on anyone the Kharadron Overlords have deemed as an enemy while they still breathe, with a footnote that clarifies embargoes on Ossiarch Bone Reapers because they don't actually breathe. It makes the code, right, this super fun thing to think about. And I want to see more of it, hopefully like in a White Dwarf or something, because not many other factions have like this one document that gives as much insight into their worldview and kind of lets you get into their minds a little bit and have a little bit of fun. That last bit I think really brings the Kharadron Overlords to life is the focus on businesses. And in this book, they really lean into that. Previously, we knew that companies were the dominant power, right? They owned the ships, they fought for trade rights, hired crew, etc. You as a player, when you're playing your Kharadron Overlords army, were commanding a fleet owned by a company. But I never felt like they leaned into the commercialization angle much. That all these fun and random companies were really competing internally. And this book does a lot to change that, but it's very subtle. First up, they're just mentioned more. It just mentions the idea of independent businesses competing with one another a lot more. For example, the devastation of the necroquake we just talked about, they measure that up to 50 businesses foreclosed in its wake. Well, those businesses are mentioned because they're important. That's 50 armies that theoretically you as a player are playing. Think about that. How many ships a company has at its disposal, and since this gold rush is happening, companies rapidly trying to build as many ships as possible. All these things with the businesses kind of taking the forefront in terms of like, how do we understand this faction when they respond to crisis is much more prevalent. And I think the place where this really shines is the artifacts. Now, I don't actually have my old copy of the old book to compare the artifact names. I think that these are new. If they're not, I apologize, but I want to list off some of these artifacts in this book. We have Gadelson's Endless Repeater, Sverig Stein Illuminator Fire Pistol, Hegsun Solutions Old Reliable Hull Plates, Zonbar Core, Det Settler Spar Torpedoes, and Coalbeard's Collapsible Compartments. Guys, these are brands. I love this so freaking much, right? It makes me think of like the old-timey Wild West advertisements, right? Buffalo Bill's exhibition sponsored by the Winchester Repeater Rifle, right? And I just think it is hilarious. It's just that little bit of flavor added to things that makes it so stinking fun. I know it's a mouthful when you're trying to list off your artifacts and things like that, but it's just those little morsels of lore that are injected into the rules that I think make this faction so stinking cool. But it's also one of those things I can't really quantify, right? When we talk about how lore changes from battle tome to battle tome with every edition, it's one of those things it's not raw information, right? The necroquake stuff is just new information that was added. But between the code being, reimagined in new and fun ways, and the idea of leaning into brands and businesses as a forefront feature of this faction, it's just more fun, right? It's just a more fun, succinct, kind of on-brand battle tome for this faction. I really do think it is a step up. It's fun, it's funny, and they still seem dangerous, right? It just leans more into what makes them unique, which I think battle tome should always do. You should always walk away from your battle tome being like, this is why I love this faction. I love it because of Coalbeard's collapsible compartments. That's just so stinking funny. I'd love to see ships that players do branded, with some of these things on their sides. I think that would be so hilarious. And so ending this video with why I think this is cool. I won't expand too much on this because I did cover a lot about why things are cool in the Kharadron Overlord series that I did. But with these changes and additions, really what it comes down to is I like the fact that the necroquake hit them hard, right? As a faction that can easily feel very isolated from world events because they just fly around, they just trade. And that's true. But what I like is that, in desperation, they found opportunity. And I feel like both elements of the desperate ramifications of the necroquake were very real and tangible, right? Ragnars losing a fifth of their fighting force is a huge deal. I felt like they were truly rocked by the event in a way that was crippling. At least for a little while, they would have been crippled as they try to figure everything out and try to understand, okay, who's dead, who's not, what ships were lost, all that kind of thing. But at the same time, I feel like it does emphasize this is why this army has a leg to stand on in going forward, right? This is why. And they saw opportunity and they're not afraid to reach out for it. And so I thought that was great. I think they did the balance of desperation and opportunity very, very well. In addition to that, those little things that I talked about, the brands and the corporate focus and the code, those are all just things that I can't really explain it to you. But if there is a unwrapped copy at your local store or something like that, just flip through it because it just makes this a fun book to engage with. And I mean that, it's just fun to read. Even if you don't have an interest in the army, it's a fun book. And so I think that those are the best battle tomes, the ones where you don't even have to be super into it as an army, just read it. And I kind of feel that way about a few factions. I mean, even the ones that I kind of on the, side want to collect, but they're just still fun books to read, are the best battle tomes to play. So friends, tell me your thoughts on the Kharadron Overlords, how you think about the faction since it's been revitalized with all this stuff. Go ahead and leave in the comments down below. We'll continue the conversation down there. Welcome, Wargamers, to the dangerous reaches of the mortal realms as we explore yet another epic tale of war and heroism. This time between the Kharadron Overlords and the Gloomspite Gits. And spoiler alert here, this is a story that begs to be turned into a little mini campaign. It's got everything from an action movie. It's just like set in the mortal realms. And so let's get into our tale. It's pulled from the Kharadron Overlords battle tome, and it's called The Battle of Scrapa Spill. The largest armada ever assembled by Barak Zahn descends upon the Greenskin Kingdom of Scrapa Spill. The admirals of the skyport believe that beneath the Junk Mountains of Ayada lies the Zangmadron, a Kharadron dreadnought carrying experimental weaponry that was brought down during the Age of Chaos. Squadrons of frigates swoop down from the ochre clouds of the spill, pummeling grots and aurochs with broadsides as Arkanaut excavation teams leap overboard and into the fray. At first, the battle seems to sway in the Kharadron's favor. The wreckage of the Zangmadron is located, but before the Barak Zahn fleet can fully extract its cargo, the Bad Moon rises above Ayada and begins to spit Lunestone meteors at the air fleet. Several vessels are smashed out of the sky to crash upon the rusty dunes of the spill. The Barak Zahn armada is forced to retreat with the few artifacts it has recovered. Its Grunstock Thunderers suffer dreadful losses, holding the Greenskin tide at bay long enough for the survivors of downed vessels to be evacuated. Okay, so in my opinion, a bit of context is needed to fully understand the gravity of the story that I just read to you. So at first glance, it seems very straightforward, right? There's a record of a ship going missing during the Age of Chaos, and through whatever means, the Kharadron Overlords have decided that it's likely in this Greenskin territory. Pretty straightforward, smash in, grab the loot, and get out, right? So why bring, and I quote, the largest armada ever assembled by Barak Zahn? Well, that's because this isn't just a Greenskin fort. Scrapa Spill is the home and kingdom of the largest Gloomspite Gits enclave, led by the savage and ruthless Skagrot the Loon King. It's in Chaman, the Realm of Metal, and it is a fortress of sorts, yes, but in practical terms, it's also just a mountain or a small range of mountains formed of scrap metal that the Gits have found over the centuries. It's an artificial landscape feature that is massive in size and scale, and how they ascertained, the lost ship's location is beyond me. But I also wanted to point out that they're not just like kicking a hornet's nest, right? It's bigger than that. Thousands to 1 odds. Also, you heard me mention a place called Ayada. That's just kind of like the area around it, where Scrapa Spill is located. So that's like, the literal stage of like the location and stuff, but the actual military action itself is nuts and goes back and forth like every awesome battle scene does. Descending from the thick, polluted clouds above Scrapa Still, like they were literally called ochre clouds, Barak Zahn fleet bombards the snot out of that place. Now, given the design of the KO ships, I imagine in my mind, it's like flying concentric rings where they have the guns on the side just all kind of pointed down at the ground, and just like a hurricane made of gun trying to clear out a landing spot for the Arkanaut. Soon after, troops are jumping overboard of these ships, just like, SEAL Team 6 of Dwarden step into the most hostile territory ever. And at first, everything is turning up Kharadron Overlords, right? They find the ship, it's loaded to the gills with guns still, which means obviously they haven't messed with it too much, and they start trying to recover it. And I imagine, just based on what we know about grots, what likely happened is that the initial barrage scared the hell out of them, and while hundreds may have died, everyone else just kind of scattered. But grots have this tendency to scatter and then reform very, very quickly and come back stronger for an attack. That is to say, as grot warbands and groups kind of retreat, they get absorbed into larger big ones, and boom, near instantly, there's this army sitting right there. It's just whatever loon boss has the most charisma, the most personality to bring under his heel, that kind of stuff. All of a sudden, you can very realistically have an army formed very quickly amongst grots. My point is, I bet there was a time when things were really quiet, right? The KO are hooking up all the rigging to the salvage of the ship, and it's like that perfect horror movie scene where it's quiet, too quiet. And it's at this point that the winds change direction. The sky darkens, the ground seems to come alive with activity as small growths begin popping up. Mushrooms and other fungal growths seep up from the earth because the bad moon has come. Now, if you're not familiar with the bad moon, I'll make it real brief here. It is a celestial body that is the source of worship of the Gloomspite Gits. They see it as a blessing and sign, or even an avatar of their god, Gorka Morka. And when this thing hands in the sky, your world becomes a living horror film, right? It gets dark, there's this sickly green glow. As I mentioned before, the earth erupts with sickly life in the forms of, slimy mushrooms and other exotic flora. And people just straight up go insane, right? Maddened by the presence of the bad moon. And very importantly to our story, little bits of the bad moon splinter off. You see, for the Gloomspite Gits, life is about using whatever natural resources they can get a hold of, which is why so many of their units use and reference mushrooms, hallucinogenic or otherwise, because it's kind of the prime flora in their chosen environment, which is caves. Makes perfect sense. Well, when the bad moon appears, it gives the green-skinned children their most prized resource, Lunestone. It's just like little bits of the meteor kind of splinter off and land on the ground. Nothing too big or grandiose in normal circumstances. But you have this armada in the sky, right? You have, stunty SEAL Team 6 on the ground trying to get the prize, and boom, all hell breaks loose. Lunestone meteors rocket from the sky and, in a twist of irony, bombard the KO fleet with attacks from above. Several ships straight up explode. My mind goes to the image of the movie, I don't know if you remember this from forever ago, Armageddon, right? Just massive fire trails of meteors just punching straight through anything they touch. And at this point, the quick smash and grab job they had planned becomes a situation where it's possible that dang near most of the skyport's military is wiped out. Again, the largest armada that they've ever formed. Their leaders sound the retreat and evacuation begins. Now, the Kharadron Overlords have recovered some amount of the technology, but not all of it by a long shot. They've suffered incredible losses in the form of Grunstock Thunderers specifically, and keep in mind, these are the heavy weapon guys, right? The notion that I get from the story is that the Grunstock Thunderers were out keeping the hordes of grots at bay during the attempted recovery of technology, but also, as it points out, when ships got downed, any surviving crew, they needed some kind of defensive action to give them a chance to get rescued. Now, here's really why I wanted to talk about this and why I think this tale is so cool. You have two very different perspectives here, and they're different from the kind of storytelling that we usually get, okay? So on the Kharadron Overlord side, it's a massive tactical military endeavor, right? An epic tale of recovering that which was lost to us and valiant and bold tactics. And like I said, it's an action movie. Like, if this was a bank heist, right, that happened in the real world and no one got killed, I'd be like, yeah, you know what? Let him keep it, right? That's hella impressive. Absolutely. It's just this crazy orchestration of ships and lots of moving parts and, I don't know, just doing things very, very quickly. But while it's happening, things go immediately from amazing to, dear God, I'm blind because there's mushrooms growing out of my eyes. There's up to thousands of grots around me, all trying to kill me. We need to leave. And all of a sudden, that technology doesn't seem quite so worth it. And while it does say that some of the technology was recovered, I am personally just going to say this is a straight up loss. Right? I don't care how you try to spin it. The experimental stuff was just sitting there in a scrap heap. It's not like they couldn't let it fall into enemy hands, right? There was no urgency to this. It's been there just chilling since the Age of Chaos when they lost the ship. Then, when they go to scrap a spell to try and recover the thing, the Lunestone is taking out Kharadron Overlord ships that are still functional, which means all you've really done is add to the pile of scrap that is Scrapa Spill, and brought attention to the fact that there's a boat full of guns sitting right there that they probably didn't know about. Again, it's been sitting there since the Age of Chaos. and they lost many, many soldiers. But on the flip side, it's like, whose fault is this, right? Like, what a weird conversation has to happen amongst Kharadron Overlord leaders after the fact of like, sorry I failed you, but honestly, how was I supposed to know that a rogue celestial object that's worshipped as deity would pop up and turn this place into a hellscape? You know what I mean? Like, at every level, this was an unsatisfactory venture for the Kharadron Overlords. But then, to me, the more fun part is thinking about the other side of this, because technically, these grots are the innocent ones who got invaded, right? They're just chilling at home, cracking open cold ones with the boys, and then immediately, without warning, are getting blasted apart from the sky, not because of anything you necessarily did. Again, the ship's just in a pile somewhere. We have no evidence to think that they were, like, trying to use the weapons or anything. There's just a piece of junk nearby that somebody else wants. And so, like, pure pandemonium ensues. The icon of your god shows up. It's just like, imagine like literally if God just like peeled the clouds back. It was like, hey, coming in like the Kool-Aid man, blowing up ships from the sky. And I just imagine myself as like one of those grots just kind of standing there watching all this happen and just being like, what the hell is going on? But super quickly, it's all over, right? The KO are gone. They left a couple of ships, which was kind, I guess. And there's mushrooms and moonstone all over the place. So yay, I guess. I don't know. Weird day. Like, what a roller coaster of emotions that had to have been for like every grot in that little area. That was just hilarious to me. I want a Black Library book that paints the Gloomspite Gits as the heroes being attacked, right? Just kind of like reskin that terrible Pearl Harbor movie, but it's like all grots trying to figure out what the heck's going on, and then like Morgan Freeman as the Bad Moon comes in and scares away all the planes. That's my in real life retelling of this story, But it's just bad acting everywhere. Everyone's like freaking out. It's like, what's going on? And then all of a sudden, this deity level thing that you're trying to worship just pops up out of nowhere when things are really crazy. It's just like, what next? What now? What now? But getting back to kind of why I started this video, the real core of why I like is that it's perfect for a campaign, because to me, a good little mini campaign is breaking down a story into multiple sections and then playing those out. So for example, the aerial assault, maybe if it's between a KO and Gloomspite Gits player, the KO guy brings all ships the first game, regardless of battle line and that kind of stuff, just thematically brings all ships, and he's trying to annihilate the enemy. The second one would be hold out as long as you can, which would be maybe the Kharadron Overlords being attacked by waves and waves and waves of Gits. And then the third one is just retreat, of just however you want to simulate the Kharadron Overlords trying to leave the battlefield. It's the perfect format. It's a nice little 3-part play, and it summarizes one coherent story. Anyway, I thought it was just very entertaining to think about, the Dwarden just hopping over the side of the ship, rappelling in, and then all of a sudden the grots just having what was otherwise a normal day until like they got obliterated and then God showed up, mix of emotion. I'm going to call it 6 in one, half a dozen the other, with good and bad there. But I'd love to hear your thoughts. Tell me what you think in the comments down below. Thank you so much for watching and listening, and I hope to catch you in my next Age of Sigmar lore video. Saviors from the sky, miners of the ether, godless profiteers, and irreverent merchants. All of these things can be used to describe the Kharadron Overlords, a race of sky-faring Dwarden, or dwarves, who long ago left the moors of solid ground and struck out amongst the clouds for survival. And while they are the most scientifically advanced faction we've seen so far, they've been able to achieve great heights of technology, mixing magic and science as we know it, to create flying cities, cloud mining, sky fleets, and trade networks. But what other factions in Age of Sigmar don't see is the price that was paid for these achievements. These heights of greatness don't come without pain and sacrifice. And so for the Kharadron Overlords, their sacrifice was the rejection of a god. They had to destroy their old worldview, the way that they honored dwarves. And they had to form the sheer mind, will, and grit to survive alone in the Age of Chaos. These are a people that lost everything and then rebuilt it all and more in the sky. And so today we are taking a look at the story of the mortal realms from the perspective of the Kharadron Overlords. My name is Doug with 2+Stuff, and in this video we're going to be breaking down this story and basically what the world events are like from their perspective. how they see the drama of gods and chaos and the forces of order unraveling before them. And before we jump into that video, I just want to give a quick shout out. I'm no longer doing ads on this channel because YouTube's monetization stuff is just getting absolutely crazy. So it is of real importance to me. If you want to support the channel, you can either become a member here on YouTube. I have some videos in the works that are going to be members only, just music and background stuff like that. Or use any of the affiliate links in my description down below, as every single time you use those, big or small, Games Workshop or not, it supports me, my wife, our cats, and the whole operation. Not Just Gaming has a whole bunch of modeling supplies, so everything you need for your next hobby project is right there. And I also want to say a shout out to the Goonhammer Network, which I am now a part of. If you want to see any cool stuff about AOS, particularly strategies regarding the Kharadron Overlords as is pertinent, head over to Goonhammer and check it out. So to begin our tale of the Kharadron Overlords, we need to head to Chamon, the realm of metal, a fantastic place of alchemy and metallurgy, mineral riches, and impossible sights. And it's here that the first tribes of dwarves, or what we would now call Dwarden, were found in the mortal realms. First of all, by Sigmar, while he was collecting isolated groups of mortals together in the Age of Myth. We talked about this, started this whole series with Sigmar's perspective, and now I'm kind of putting in the little bits of timeline to kind of have some context for us. And at this point, we are really talking about the dwarves as we know them from fantasy battles, right? Because at this point, they've kind of carried over a lot of those traditions. It's a land that's, full of mineral riches, and it's a dwarven paradise. Build holds that can, build deep into these mountains. They can use volcanoes, clockwork fortifications. It's just everything we remember from the fantasy battles world, just kind of elevated a bit. And as I pointed out in that Sigmar perspective video, was that this amount of time is indeterminate, meaning we have no idea how long the Age of Myth actually was, but we do know it spanned multiple generations, like many, many, many. To the point where Sigmar initially finds a whole bunch of just like despondent groups of dwarves here and there, and then he forges them into an empire. The species begins to boom, just like humanity booms. Elves are kind of creeping, but they're kind of a slow-growing race. A boom for them is still pretty moderate by every other race's standards. And while the Age of Myth is a very long and ill-defined time, there are a few very important things we need to mention regarding the origin of the KO. After they were established a bit, these dwarves who were running around the mortal realms began calling themselves Dwarden, possibly as a moniker for the changing of the setting and that kind of stuff. I mean, obviously Games Workshop has their reason for doing it, but I mean, in terms of the internal world of the lore, they just kind of perceive themselves as being different. But the thriving population of Dwarden were at one point reunited with their deities, Grugni and Grimnir. And this was a big deal. It's a big deal anytime any people group are reunited with a deity, especially one that embodies kind of their aesthetics, their themes so well. And once these two were returned, Grimnir, who's really focusing on the martial aspect of the Dwarden, they're going to grow up to be warriors. But then Grugni also has the emphasis on the smithing, the craftsmanship. And so as soon as these two return, instead of just having a population boom, because now they're safe and secure thanks to Sigmar, now they're having like a renaissance. It's more than just a population boom, but like they're getting better at everything. Grugni's teaching them arcane magic, mastery engineering. Grimnir's out there leading battles left and right because he's a very antsy person. And they turned this whole region from being, Chamon, the realm of metal, where, it's a perfect environment for dwarves because it caters to their style, and he morphs it into, it's that, but now it's also like an industrial powerhouse of the mortal realms. Sure, they lacked much in the way of food and water, but every single other civilization needed metals, jewels, raw materials, that kind of stuff, and so these became the forges of civilization that Sigmar and that early pantheon used to kind of bring the Age of Myth to its heights. And as a result of that, some more stuff started to happen. Grugni began designing and making more technology for his people. Again, he's the god of smithing and crafting and all this kinds of things. And it said that the smoke and breath of his toils drifted into the air of Chamon to create a ether gold. Is a substance that we'll talk about more shortly. But basically, there's a mythology built around it that it's Grugni's breath or something like that up in the sky. The point is, in the Age of Myth, people are beginning to look upwards and realize that there's still mineral riches to be had, but in gaseous form, not just rocks. That's the whole point of this. The actual origins of the stuff is ultimately irrelevant. But it also becomes apparent that the other species have reunited with their deities, and things are accelerating uncomfortably so, right? Like the pace of change and development and, invention really begins to go too fast for anyone to be super comfy, because now all the gods are returned. We now have the elven gods making new elves and reforging them. There's a lot of mystery shrouded around them. That's odd. Human populations are just out the nose, spreading everywhere. It's getting to be a lot. Because I want to point out here that, like, if we think about human technological progress before the Industrial Revolution, it's a very slow moving, chart. If you have technological progress going up and then time on the bottom scale, you'll see like a very, very moderate kind of like angle it's going upward. Sometimes it goes down. We lose a little bit of technology. And then when we hit the Industrial Revolution, it's, for all intents and purposes, it's a vertical line. We're growing so much relative to how long it took us to learn things before. They are basically doing the same thing, but when it comes to not just population, but technology, magic usage, all these things are putting massive stresses on the realms. And while we don't have a ton of information about what these fullest, what that exponential part of the chart looks like, what they were able to create, we know a few things. We know that they built these insane clockwork fortresses. Arkanaut mentions one specifically in the Realmgate Wars as this like impenetrable set of gears that's always in motion, and it's like this unassailable fortress. We've seen steam machines, both for mining and, it's rough vehicles for transporting things here and there, and even some crude flying machines. Now, flying machines are not, they're not truly new, right? They've had crude dirigibles and gyrocopters, that kind of stuff, but those can only be kept aloft for a short amount of time before needing refueling. Energy was always the problem. And that was until research began into ether gold. So we're going to circle back to that material that was in the sky. Think of it as a cloud that is so dense that it feels like a solid. Like if you were to put your hand in it, you would feel the difference between your hand moving through empty air and the ether gold, but it's not a solid. It just stands there suspended. It has an insane amount of buoyancy, which is important because it means if you put enough of it into something like a dirigible, it can be held as a balloon. But also, you could burn it and it becomes a highly efficient fuel, which is the use that really started to gain traction. I'm sure at some point people had some inside of like balloons and stuff like that, but it's when they really started to think of it in the context of fuel and energy exchange that things really got crazy. Now, I am a history nerd if you have not figured that out by now, so I'm going to put this into a historical context for you. In 1861, the Monitor was the first thoroughly modern submarine. Okay, steam-powered, ironclad warship used in the U.S. Civil War. Its battle with the Merrimack is the stuff of legends over here for Civil War nerds in the U.S. But imagine if you are the designer of the Monitor, right? And it just rolled off the line and you feel so proud, okay? Like, wow, this is it, guys. Next step in human evolution in terms of our ability to create machines, whatever that machine might be, war or otherwise. This is an achievement. And then you look at your neighbor, right, the next nation over, and they launch the first nuclear-powered submarine with almost 100 years of technological progress on what you just made. Named the Nautilus because it's so science fiction-y that they took the name from 40,000 Leagues Under the Sea. That is the kind of gap that exists between steam machines of the Dwarden and what we're now tapping into with the ability to use ether gold as energy. That's kind of how I'm dividing this. Yes, both technologies do the same thing. They're both subs and flying machines, but they're vastly different in their designs and, most importantly, their limitations. These top Dwarden engineers were working tirelessly on it, basically strapping crude ether engines, as they'd know, to boats. Like specifically just boats that you would use on water because they didn't know what else to do. Or they would modify like existing things like gyrocopters or dirigibles with these engines. And I kind of think of it as like the Model T era of the car, right? They're out there, people see them, and they're kind of becoming prevalent, but they're not like ubiquitous. They're not everywhere. These are only the central hubs of technology that are going to have any kind of way to demonstrate these engines. But all the best minds are already looking at this as like, this is the technological revolution. Like, I mean, travel has been the biggest burden on this civilization that has tackled every single problem up till now. Age of Myth is when everything is going thumbs up for the good guys. So like, the future is so bright. However, they would never reach that future. At least the Dwarden would never reach that future, because while the dwarves and Dwarden prospered in Chaman with these crazy technological wonders, an ancient sickness had begun to seep into every mortal realm right under their noses. Now, I have a dedicated video about the realm of metal, Chaman. There's a great story, kind of like a prehistory that happened in the Age of Myth. I'm going to give the briefest of sum-ups, but essentially a giant god beast, a metal dragon, or I believe it was more like a griffin type thing, landed in the dead center of Chaman. Okay, and it had so much mass and so much weight and magical power to it that it basically started to bend the island chain that was kind of near it. So it kind of became like its own little center of a solar system. Everything was in these nice straight lines. The griffin lands, and all of a sudden everything starts to bow and contort and twist around it. There's a big ritual that was encouraged by some of the Dwarden to get rid of the beast, and instead it tore open a hole for Tzeentch to enter the realm of metal. Essentially, this was all a big Tzeentchian plot to get these Dwarden to enact a ritual that would ultimately let Tzeentch in. I'm sure there were many humans involved. I know dwarves are not a magical race by any stretch, but I'm saying that like things were set in motion to bring that into fruition. It was a big deceit to get this door open. When it does, demons come pouring through like water and just flooding over the industrial powerhouses of the mortal realms at the time. Everybody's running in absolute panic. There is a huge detonation zone, like where that griffin landed and then where the rent in reality came through, that whole area is just gone. And I try to think about like what it would be if you were some of the dwarves like in other holds looking at what's going on, right? You know, you're having some geographic problems, right? Your ground is shaking and all these kinds of things. And then you see a huge explosion from one of the big cities. I mean, just abject, horribly massive explosion. What do you think is happening? Because honestly, for the most part, they probably thought it was an accident at first. Some of these new technologies got crazy. Maybe someone put too much ether gold in an engine and it detonated, and here we are. But it's as the vanguard of flamers and screamers start coming from that destructive aftermath of this big explosion that people are realizing, no, this is something totally different. It's something that they have no context for. Remember, generations upon generations had no idea what chaos was, and now the largest demon army of Tzeentch is rolling directly through your downtown. Some tried to fight and died. Most ran, and they were run down, meaning they died in the pursuit. Some further holds thought that they could have a chance. Maybe if we just, go into our holds, lock our doors real tight, we can just kind of weather the storm. But one by one, they started to fall, just like, candles in a mine being snuffed out. Tzeentch warbands assembled and began targeting the holds that gave the most resistance. And when I say they targeted the holds, they did everything. Like, they had mortal warbands, demons coming in. Remember, even though Tzeentch was the big architect behind Chaman, it's the realm he had his eye on, every chaos god was in every realm. So you've also got Slanesh running around, units running around, Khorne stuff, there's Nurgle warbands, like all of these things are descending. And it's this act of mass murder and destruction that happens in Chaman. It really breaks the Dwarden culture as a unified culture in a way that it'll never come back from. Basically, their responses to this action of Tzeentch coming in and everything getting messed up is how we determine the different kinds of Dwarden. Some reacted by hiding in lava flows and becoming more mercenary to maybe bend morals but survive, fire slayers. Some ran to flee with the races of men back to Azir. They became parts of the cities of Sigmar. You know what I mean? So everyone's responses to this are how we get these various factions. And so this is really where the dots are connected between the carnage happening in Chaman and the technological wonder of the Age of Myth engineers. Because some of those Dwarden, as they're all running, again, another possible reaction to the carnage, is they hop inside of these crude flying machines and they just try to see how can we get as far away as possible. Now that's actually not a bad plan. But it's important to remember that Chaman is hard to navigate, so being able to go up and over obstacles is a huge boon. And I'm sure that some of these people who know how to run the flying machines would also know where others are. Meaning, if you are, sharing research on ether engines with another Dwarden clan 200 miles away, you at least have somewhere to go. Like, well, at least I know if this machine is going to last to anywhere, I need it to last towards the next airport, basically. And as these ships are flying out, they're getting assaulted by screamers and flamers of Tzeentch, and they really immediately began to learn it's best if we huddle up. Because if they're apart, they get picked apart, right? If they're lone ships fall very easily, but if you act as a flotilla or something, everything survives much better. Now, of course, we in our modern world understand that, flotillas and envoys and that kind of stuff, convoys rather, going from one place to another in naval stuff, that's pretty ubiquitous for us, but for them they had to learn that on the fly. Pardon the pun. And this becomes a really defining lesson, because when that shattering event happens of all the different races of dwarves going in different directions and taking on different identities, the lessons that teach them how to survive really are what give them their character. What was the lesson that we have here? Well, when we work together, we survive. That's it. It's one that permeates every aspect of their life. We're going to keep coming back to this, but it's a major theme of this army. You know what won't help us survive? The gods. Our own god personally abandoned us. Grugni was nowhere to be seen. And this was not an instantaneous, singular event. There was a whole gap of time where prayers and requests were being sent out to Grugni as things were getting worse. The Lode Griffin thing that messed up Chaman was there for a while, and he was just not helping. And this is after a time where they had spent generations with him. Grugni was a very involved part of his people until he just disappeared. So, what is it like if you know God exists, you've hung out, and he is actively ignoring you leaving on red? Right? And I'm not talking about some abstract, you get the little, Christian plaques that are like, when I looked, I only saw one set of footprints. Where were you? Nothing like that, okay? It's more like, I went out to Wendy's last week with Grugni, and why isn't he answering his phone, right? It's not some ethereal thing. He's a dude who's not here, and he should be here. And this is the foundation of the faction-wide resentment towards Grugni. And this carries from the Age of Myth, right here as the Age of Chaos is dawning, all the way to the most recent thing that involved the Kharadron Overlords in the Broken Realm series. There's a moment where Grugni shows up to help his people, but he has to disguise himself as a Kharadron Overlord because they do not like him. He basically scares Be'lakor away, but that's all he does. But the idea was he couldn't show up as Grugni, he had to look like something else. And the idea is simple. Where was Grugni when we were at our worst? Right? Sigmar found the early dwarves and freed you two, Grimnir and Grugni, from something that they are still very vague upon. We don't know how our gods got captured, but that's your secret, whatever. And then you were here when things were awesome, and we were, rolling in money, building all kinds of technology and toys. Grimnir's out there having a great time with war. But when things got rough, you just left us. And so the general collective Kharadron Overlord attitude towards their own deity and the Pantheon as a whole is just sawed off. I'm doing a ton of paraphrasing and possibly projecting, but that's just the basic vibe they give off whenever it comes to religious matters or anything with the divine. It's just, I want you to note that undercurrent because it goes through everything. Okay, so sorry about that little detour. Let's get back to our crude flotilla. At first I mentioned they were living like raiders, right? The flotillas would roll up to a place, one or two ships would detach. They would either go down to the ground for supplies or fishing around the clouds to find more ether gold to keep these engines going. And this becomes a very crucial time period for these Dwarden, because right now they are essentially a rabble of sky refugees. But the next step in their societal evolution is what forges them into the Kharadron Overlords. By the way, I'm on page 5 of my notes, and we just founded the faction, so I thought that would share that. And when I was trying to tackle the revolutions that happened in this time period, I broke it down into 3, just to kind of keep my brain organized. There was an industrial revolution, a revolution in societal hierarchies and values, and a governmental revolution. And if you don't have all 3 of these, you don't have the Kharadron Overlords. If it misses any one of them, this faction is completely different. And so let's go through them one by one. I talked about an industrial revolution. One of the defining features of the faction, known as Kharadron Overlords as we know them now, is that they live in these colossal cities in the sky, known as skyports. But these skyports are, they had some very humble beginnings, we'll say, because really the first skyport was just the first time one ship threw a line and tied itself to another one. The early time of the Kharadron Overlords was all about just finding these desperate ships who made it out of the Age of Chaos, or at least the epicenter of destruction, and kind of pooling them all together. What resources do we actually have at our disposal? How good are these ships working? How can we keep them afloat? Like that kind of organizational structure started. And to do that, you need materials, you need tools. Not just gas, but like literal tools to fix the engines. Okay, well, if we want to bind these boats together and make a floating platform for ourselves, that requires raw materials to be processed and industry to process them. Now we need people to take boats away from your city to go collect those things. So you got to build more boats. And so it feels like they're playing an early game of like Settlers of Catan, where they're just like, I have boats, but I need wood and sheep. And there must have been a point in this civilization where industry was set up enough that the Sky City could begin to grow. And that's really what I see as kind of the technological starting point for these guys when they stopped just having to repair and use what they scavenged during the Age of Chaos and began creating things. They were able to build the technological stuff required for new ether engines, which now means that there's an entirely new branch of technological growth that wouldn't have happened otherwise, because now they're experimenting in real time. And it's to the death. Well, the more engines you build, the more weight that you can carry, which means your city can grow. And you can use that space to get more industry, a foundry where now you're melting and making your own steel beams for things. Shipyards, ether engine factories, places to refine materials. Now you can have places for schools where we can begin teaching each other how to sail the winds. What I'm saying is, I mentioned before that there was like that scale of technological progress for humans where it's a very slow raise and then it's like a vertical line when we hit the Industrial Revolution. There was a point where they got enough ships and resources and people together to start building actively in the sky. And I feel like that is the same point in their timeline. As I think about the comparison between human history and what's being described in this book, I know, it's just for fun. But I think about this though. In the 1500s, right, that's Leonardo da Vinci time, the Renaissance. Progress is slow and painful and glacially paced. But what if in that exact same time period, everyone already knew how to do everything that we know today? They simply didn't have the industry to do it. So, for example, you take a bunch of the best people and smartest thinkers today and you drop them back there. How much more quickly do those revolutions happen in human history? Because that's essentially what we have here. We have all these architects and engineers in Dwarden who are all smart. They built these ships. They kept them going. And so the second that the resources become physically available, now they can use that potential, all that knowledge they have. It's already ready to go, hitting the ground running, which is kind of a cool difference to think about history. What if you could just drop someone back there who knew those things? Now I want to move on from the industrial side and talk about a new form of government. And this is where we introduce ourselves to the next major evolution of these Dwarden. Because at first, everything is just about survival. Everyone has everything in common because I care about my neighbor more than I care about Tzeentch demons. That math is really easy. I'll do anything I can for them. But the minute there's stability and resources become scarce, well, that's when, rifts and arguments start to form. Each captain is a captain of their own ship. So what does authority structure look like when you try to get together as a flotilla to survive? Remember, when we work together, we live. Do you set it up that whoever, boat you're on, that captain is in charge? Because that mimics the old, hold rules. If you were the hold father or whatever, you had absolute authority over your domain. But these ships are very tiny. So it's no, that doesn't quite work. And so the whole ability of these guys to work together while they're trying to do these industrial revolutions, it just became clear this isn't working. Enter the code. Part legal document, part cultural record, part history, moral compass. It's about everything. These early Sky Dwarden sat down and created a society from scratch. Now, I'm going to list a bunch of stuff that comes off the top of my head, but essentially these are the kinds of questions that needed to be asked and answered and agreed upon so that society could function. So the examples I came up with, we need ether gold. Who's getting it? Okay, right now we're creating a division of labor. How are they provided for in return? Which means now you need a currency to make that happen. Now we need to map the skies and choose destinations. There's so much we don't know about all this. How are we going to, discover new knowledge and store and record it? Because these original builders and ship designers need to retain every iota of information that they have. They need to develop schools and teachers and housings and work details and maintenance crews. Because if that knowledge is lost, that is more priceless than any one of these ships at this point. Going back to our skyboats, that's kind of the, the aesthetic thing around Kharadron Overlords. What happens if two ships lay claim to the same ether gold vein? Like it's bigger than expected and you didn't realize the two were connected. How are the crews paid? How are the percentages and the bonuses? What if a captain dies? Who builds ships? Where? Do they have a say in who captains them? All these kinds of questions. The code addresses all of these things to a painful, minute detail. And these early captains form a council that would evolve over time. Now, this is, of course, as they're coming up with problems, they're finding solutions and trying to work together. But I want to back out here for just a second from the process of making the code. Because it's more than just a legal and social structure document, right? The way you resolve disputes and accusations, that's most of the stuff I talked about before. But it also talks about your interaction with outsiders, how we provide for lesser fortunate or different classes within our society, what we value, what we don't tolerate. All of these things go into creating and defining the character of a people, the cultural sticks and carrots, if you will. And as skyports grow, they build satellites. They grow their own skyports. Remember, the Age of Chaos was about 500 years, and we're far beyond rafts being tied together as this society develops. The code kept every member of society active, useful, taken care of, and these dwarves were all given a singular purpose for their lives. And just as their ancestors flourished in the Rock of Chaman, these Kharadron Overlords applied that same industrious life to the skies. And how they flourished is represented by the evolution of the code, because values change over time and places. People become more distinct in isolation, and so when you and I play as the Kharadron Overlords, this is what the various skyports are trying to represent. These distinctions in how their particular codes have evolved to represent their values in their society. As these other groups reinterpret or misinterpret the code, they adjudicate crime differently and so on, and all those things go into building a distinct people group. And this is simply the rough game-y approximation of it. But as a whole, they chose to write all of this out simply so that they could work together. Remember, together we survive. They cannot rely on anyone else, and if they band together, they can make it work. However, there are consequences to this decision. Because the very survival tools that these Dwardens are using are also changing them dramatically. And that kind of moves us into our third and final part, and that is a revolution of societal hierarchies and values. Because the system of the code doesn't work if everyone is out for themselves, thinking that they are too important to do whatever labor needs to be done. We need to incentivize people to find work and contribute in a meaningful way. How do you do that when everything's changed so radically for these dwarves? So thinking about the origins of them, their worldview, pre all of this, we really get the sense from the fantasy battles section. I feel like they were just very much classical Tolkien dwarves, like from J.R.R. Tolkien's work. Mining, family lineages, holds, territory, greed. These are all kind of qualities or themes that are pretty generic for dwarves as a whole. But those tendencies look very different in this new environment. Some are obvious. We're not using underground holds anymore. We're all in ships. But some are more subtle. Like, say, what do you do if your family lineage is the thing that gives you credit or value, but your whole family's dead and so is your hold? They're a society that reveres history deeply. They record it. They have the big book of grudges and all these kinds of things. What if that history is just wiped away? Machismo and your lineage and your bloodline, all those things were used as social capital in the old world, or the age of myth, I should say, but none of that matters now. No one cares if you are Gimli, son of Gloim. This is, if you'll pardon the pun, all hands on deck. Everybody works. No one is too good for any job. And so the way that the dwarves, now the Kharadron Overlords culture shifted to meet these realities, right? What are the, again, cultural carrots and sticks, the things we value? How do we put that into this nice direction? Well, they decided to do it through two things: mercantilism and self-determination. What this really means, though, is that it is a achievement-based society. When the MVP is the captain who returns with the most ether gold, a new kind of race commences. Who can be the best captain? What kind of skills are needed to be the best kind of captain? Once you have the best captain, how do you get them to invest in the best ships and crew? How do you navigate the skies? So simply by saying, hey guys, we need one thing, ether gold, an entire industrial race kicks off of people's value saying, well, I want to be the one who provides the most for my people. That's an honorable thing. And from that, essentially hundreds of quote-unquote small businesses began to form. Loose bartering became contractual work. A monetary value started being assigned to these Dwarden who had skills that were needed. And really what it is how much ether gold can you contribute to this society? And this is, for the dwarves, an entirely new measurement of character. Yes, they were all about gold. They liked mining and kind of hoarding wealth and all that stuff. But it's different when it's, first of all, to the death, and it's specifically to provide for everybody. It's not about hoarding the thing. It's about giving it back so that we all live. How well do you provide for the greater whole and balance the skills, technology, and manpower needed to do so? And to give you a sense of kind of the equivalence of these things, when you read the Fireslayer battle tome, we are regaled with these epic crusades in the halls of their, honored heroes. Like these great battles that happened, they're recording all of their grandiose achievements. Whereas when it comes to the Kharadron Overlords, we are regaled with the incomprehensible sums of ether gold. They are the same thing to their respective people. The martial prowess, the achievements on the battlefield for the Fireslayers are mimicked, or I guess kind of represented by, the accumulation of ether gold for the Kharadron Overlords. It's just how they brag. It's their capital. It's what they have to offer. Now, getting on a practical level, this is a point of view video after all. Let's say that you are a Dwarden that's just come of age in the Kharadron Overlords. What does that kind of society look like? Well, right off the bat are a series of trials to see if you're a good fit for the skies. And this is where you perform your duties as a deckhand, and you're basically judged by a council and a bunch of captains. If you fail this trial, you can take up work as one of the many skyport-based positions: forges, textiles, public services, whatever. But if you succeed and you are chosen, you will be assigned to an Arkanaut company to serve as a deckhand. And you're going to spend a lot of time in this particular position, because they rotate around the ship. You're going to go to all the different sections of it. You're going to learn all the different, mechanisms of a modern ship and really see what appeals to you. So maybe you're a gunner one week, next week you're running the engines, then you're cleaning the deckhand. Now you kind of work with navigation, all those kinds of things. Whatever kind of particular aptitude you have, that's what you're going to hone in on. Perhaps even going to a specialized school to sharpen your skills. And this is how Arkanaut Company can evolve into different roles. They can, upgrade, they can go to colleges, become navigators, that kind of stuff. But essentially, everyone needs to make sure that you're not going to be a liability on the ship before you can become a member of an important part of the crew, rather. Now, if you show a bit of aptitude in everything, or you just seem to have a leadership aura about you, you could be chosen to go to a military academy, which is another set of educations and trials that's really meant to sift through the Kharadron Overlords and find the ones who were born to be captains. Or, again, as I said, if you showed adept skill at navigation, now it's time that they drop you off at port so you can go to the Navigators Guild and refine that craft. Basically, the whole society works as a flowchart meant to drop you in the right position for your skill sets and aptitudes. Would you be useful in the sky? Yes or no? What are you good at? No, are you good at this? Yes or no? Are you good at that? Yes or no? And then basically once you find what someone is good at, how can we push this to 11? Right? Investing in everyone makes us stronger as a whole. Remember the lesson we're talking about. When we work together, we survive. So yeah, someone might not rise above, they have to have janitors somewhere, I'm sure. But if you invest in him and make sure he's the best, that dwarf will love his life and work to the end with absolute precision and perfection and make the place clean, safe, and wonderful for everybody. If you invest in them, they'll do it. And when you put all of these things that we've talked about for the last, I'm looking at my clock here, 40 minutes or so, when you put it all together, you get a very interesting and a very intense kind of people. They are radically independent to the point where they rail against dependency on anything. They place an immense amount of weight on personal accomplishments. There's no honor or title or whatever that you can use to impress them. I need to see you do something amazing. They're also shrewd businessmen and women, down to the most minute detail. In fact, so minute details that people often feel like they're dealing with the devil when they enter into a contract, because it's always the fine print that gets you. By what I mean, it's like, the captain says, okay, we got you here, and the person's like, well, when do we land? It's like, oh, we don't land unless you pay us a landing fee. You only paid to get here. Like that contract keeps evolving over time, and you just kind of keep tricking people. And this goes on for some time. They do a tremendous amount of work. Again, it took all three of those things to come together to make this a faction, and for hundreds of years they were allowed to prosper. In fact, the Kharadron Overlords are one of the very few armies that not only survived the Age of Chaos, but technically thrived during it, which is kind of backwards for the good guys, as you would think, but they did great. And then at some point in their history, they looked down and they saw something new. Light had opened up in the fields of Akshi, and they went to investigate, and there it was, Sigmar's entry into the Mortal Realms. In fact, one of the first actions within the Mortal Realm story is Sigmar sending a whole bunch of Stormcast Eternals into Chamon to look for the dwarves. So, they're probably looking at these dudes like, something's going on down there, and they are seeing that these new guys, the Stormcast, are picking fights with all the Chaos factions. And all of the leaders of the Kharadron Overlords are looking at this and like, well, this is a new war, and with new war comes new opportunity. And they're kind of doing the math, and they're like, well, we can deal with these guys, the Stormcast. They're willing to talk to us, have a conversation. The other guys just want to eat us or do whatever crazy chaos ritual. But Stormcast, they at least seem civil. And it seems like they're looking to colonize, which means what? Trade and money. Not just the transportation of goods and services, but things like maps. You know how useful a Kharadron Overlord map would be if they can go up and just scout the entire area? And so after seeing that, Sigmar was able to create bastions of order that were stable enough for them to conduct business, the Kharadron Overlords descended and became part of the Pantheon of Order. Now, this is kind of a tenuous moment, right? Because a whole civilization that actively rejects the gods, with a particular disdain for their own, are talking to Stormcast Eternals who are literally part of the Storm God and his personal emissaries. But the needs here are too great to be ignored. The forces of order need stuff, and the Kharadron Overlords are willing to and able to provide it for a price. And when I say help, what do I mean? What do the Kharadron Overlords provide the forces of order? Trade, transportation, scouting, technology, like they're sharing their technology, which is not necessarily the same as trade. Surveying, and more. All the things that the Kharadron Overlord learned to do, but just for hire. And as we've discussed the various realms when I did a series on them, they're all so different. They all have things that they provide and things that they desperately need. So for example, Gur is known to provide tons of the food, the raw meat that makes the cities of Sigmar possible. That has to be traded. Well, you load a bunch of meat onto a ship, you go to Chaman, trade the meat for a whole bunch of metal, and then you bring the metal to Gur where it's not plentiful. At the same time as getting a whole bunch of new business ventures, they were also reintroduced to some long-lost cousins. The Dwarden who fled to Azir, becoming part of the cities of Sigmar, and those who hid deep under natural fortifications of volcanoes, the Fire Slayers. And while there's a form of mutual respect, there's not much else. All these different groups did exactly what they needed to in order to survive, and it pulled them in very different directions. What we can say is that the KO are not jazzed about any of the religious zealots. Okay, so like the Fire Slayers trying to put Grimnir back together, they're looking at that and they're like, nah. You know, more of a good riddance type thing. Okay, one less Dwarden god to mess with our destiny. But there's not outright confrontation over it. And realistically, that brings them up to their most current point in the history. They've shown up consistently throughout the Rumgate Wars. They were there. They had a great scene at the end of like all the different ships firing and like this great whirlwind mass descending from the sky and pulverizing the ground, shooting up demons. There's a bunch of great imagery and story arcs with these guys, but those are the main points. Their origins define an inordinate amount of their character. If you want the specific stories, you can of course read the timeline. I go through a bunch of them here on the channel. They were knocked around a whole bunch in the necroquake, and then they jumped into the Era of the Beast by fighting for Vindicarum. Like I said, Grugny made a low-key appearance, and it seems he kind of wants to reconnect, but that's a story that's for another day, I suppose. And so let's end this video like I end all of them by simply asking the question, why are these guys cool? What is it about the Kharadron Overlords that we've been talking about this entire time? And there's a few things, right? The first one is just adapt or die. I love those stories of just things had to go in a different direction because we were headed on a course for self-destruction. And that's what so many of the Dwarven holds did. They were like, oh, we can survive, we'll batten down the hatches. And you couldn't. That lesson we talked about of when we work together, we survive, that permeating through a society to where they invest the most that they can into every member of it to make them all stronger is a really cool worldview because it sounds exceptionally compassionate, which flies in the face of everything you know about dwarves who are very gruff and uncaring, but it's more utilitarian than it is, I should say, kind. Regardless though, it makes for a very efficient society. I love that they are essentially apostates in a setting full of deities, right? Like Sigmar and Nagash pour their essence into their soldiers, the Sylvaneth are built by Alariel, and the Kharadron Overlords are like, and we're also here, guys. That's it. And we are also here. And lastly here, I wanted to throw up, in addition to all the things we talked about today, there's something to be said for a faction that narratively has a reason to be everywhere. There's just something really nice when you never have to try too hard to come up with a story as to why your factions are fighting. And the KO are everywhere. They're transporting everything, fighting all the time. Being hired for just about any job you can imagine. I love that stuff. It makes narrative games so much more simple. But friends, this video is almost at an hour long on my end. I'm going to go ahead and wrap it up. I would love to hear your thoughts on the Kharadron Overlords. Tell me some of your favorite stories about them. Did I miss anything? Other events that you think are point of view defining for them? I would love to know in the comments down below, and I look forward to chatting with you guys there. Thank you so much for watching and listening, and I can't wait to hang out with you again. Happy wargaming.